Hello, my name is Bryant Garth, and Professor Alves asked me to talk a little bit about the Florence Access to Justice project. So I'll give you a little bit of my personal history, a little bit about the project, and a little bit about the future. To start, I was a third-year law student planning on working in a private law firm in Palo Alto, where Stanford Law School was located. And I saw a notice on a bulletin board one day that said Research Fellowship in Florence. So I investigated and I ultimately applied for the job, and Mauro Cappelletti hired me to become one of the research assistants on the Florence Access to Justice project, which was funded already at that point by the Ford Foundation and co-directed by Earl Johnson, Jr. So I went to work for Mauro Cappelletti in Florence, and I should say a little bit about him. This was my first job, and he was a grand professor in the classic Italian, or you could say continental, or even Latin American style. He constantly had dinner parties. He knew the professors all around the world, and the people that passed through Florence in those days were the giants of comparative law, including many Americans like Mark Galanter, David Trubeck. When I started, there were 3 American research assistants, partly to help with linguistic matters because Professor Cappelletti was not a native English speaker. But as I was working there, I gradually assumed more of the responsibility, in part because Mauro was having some issues with his research assistants, other research assistants at the University of Florence. So I began to be more involved in the project, and coincidentally, at that very moment, after 1 year in the project, the European University opened in Florence, and Mauro became one of its first professors. So the whole project moved to the European University Institute, and incidentally, I got a PhD there because I was able to stay for 3 years. The general report had this basic outline of 3 waves. The first, legal aid; the second, public interest, collective rights; and the third was kind of alternative dispute resolution. That framework exactly came from Mauro Cappelletti. It fit his profile. He had worked on legal aid with Earl Johnson. He had then worked on public interest and class actions. And then he was getting interested, and the Ford Foundation was getting interested in alternative dispute resolution. So the wave matter definitely came from Mauro. I think the emphasis I put on the general report was on the making rights effective part, the kind of welfare state aspect, the idea that if you have rights and they're not effective, they are worthless. I think this was the programmatic aspect of access to justice. And the sad story is, even at the time we published it, it was already being undermined. Ronald Reagan was elected president of the United States in 1980. Margaret Thatcher was already in power. And the kind of programmatic aspect of access to justice kind of evaporated in much of the Western world. But I think today you have a new access to justice project, which I think is already getting to be better than the one we had before. Ours was a first effort, kind of underfunded, but with big ideas. And I think the new project has those big ideas. Probably doesn't have as much funds as it should have, but I think is looking to be an outstanding contribution. I'm happy to be part of it as well. And I think it helps to remedy some of the things that were missing from access to justice, including Africa, for example. It also has a reference to criminal justice, which I think if you're talking about access to justice, you have to keep in mind the role of criminal justice. So as I say, I'm happy to be, in a way, returning to access to justice, because most of my academic career was, in fact, in the sociology of law, kind of explaining why access to justice didn't catch on in the Western world at the moment that I thought it would, and take us to a really effective welfare state. The last thing is that the project today can take into account these dramatic things that are happening today. Two are important. Obviously, the COVID virus, COVID-19, is something that affects justice everywhere, and I'm really happy to see the project is involved with that. The second, which I think we all need to think more about, is the role of the Black Lives Matter movement in access to justice. And just to say a last word, a little bit provocative maybe, is that we could imagine a wave of access to justice that involves identity in more systematic ways. There's a sense that in today's world, with minorities, especially disadvantaged minorities, getting a far different brand of justice than those of majority races and ethnic groups and religions, that maybe we need to focus more on going toward a system where those who are minorities are taught more by people like them, are represented in court more by people by them, are judged and policed by more people like them. And I think the Black Lives Matter has made us well aware of the challenge of doing that.